It is almost 6 o'clock, so does everybody have their tea and have their little snack? Okay, good.
Thank you.
No, thank you to our wonderful speakers here. As most of you probably know, we do this is part of our Thursday night speaker series where we try to bring in one speaker each month on the third Thursday of the month. We had to reschedule last month because of weather. This month we're having weather trouble again, so thank you all for braving it and coming out. I guess I should say hi if you haven't met me. I'm Kieran, I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator. And we can do these awesome programs because of our wonderful members. So if you are a member, thank you. If you aren't a member with the Rice County Historical Society, you can talk to me or Dave if you're interested, and we can answer any questions you might have. It's an awesome way to support your local history. Let's, I guess, give it up for Tamara Thayer, and who's going to talk about the mystery of Barbara Fritchie.
Well, thank you all, neighbors and friends, for coming to help me celebrate tonight. I can hardly believe that it's already December 3rd, 1862. I mean, it just seems like Christmas is right around the corner, and on a chilly day like today, it's nice to have warm tea with friends. My niece asked me tonight, and get emotional, if I would share with you a little incident that happened just 2 months ago, and that was with Stonewall Jackson. And you know, when she asked me, she said, you know, I don't understand why you would risk your life for a flag. This is why I get emotional. To this younger generation, to my niece right here in front, it's just a flag. But to those of us who are older, not many of us in my home today are as old as I am, we have been around since the beginning of this country. My family came to the colonies and settled in the Pennsylvania colony when I was just 5 years old. So I feel like I have been a part of this American culture from the very beginning. When we settled in Pennsylvania, my dad, he ran a nice leather hat shop and had leather gloves and was making quite a nice living. But you know, he was really involved with the politics and heard so much about how this country wanted to become independent. And so because of that, that's why we moved here to Frederick, Maryland. We are so blessed in Frederick to be so close to where everything is happening. We are right at the crossroads of these 13 colonies. We are right literally in the middle of everything, of history. So when my family moved, and as you know, the home I grew up in is right next door to my home here. And my late husband took over the leather business, and he often made leather goods for people. I can remember when I was only 10 years old, just a mile down this Carroll Creek was George Washington's original headquarters. When he would come by, he would stop and he would get leather chaps from my dad or need his riding gloves fixed from my dad, and I would visit with him. I would hear about some of the private things that these patriots were planning way before it happened, way before we became a country. I was just 10 years old when they were thinking about declaring our independence. Sure enough, as you know, once we became an independent country, George Washington would continue to come through Frederick and meet with the people he wanted as part of his government. And he would have me serve tea. I was so honored. Here I am, a young teenager, and I would gather the herbs from our garden and make, just as you're having today, the original home tea from my garden. And it was nice that I could listen to their politics and their planning of this new country. And while doing that, I voiced my opinion. Now, a lot of women in that day were to be silent, but I was too young to know better, so I spoke up. George Washington liked that kind of personality where we spoke our mind. And as a birthday gift, several years before he died, he gave me a complete tea set, which I'm serving you with today. This whole set here is what he gave me in honor of my birthday many years ago. Here in Frederick, I watched as we, one by one, sewed a new star on our flag. And as you can see today, we now have 34 stars. And it just breaks my heart that this rebellion is considering dividing this. How can we do that? How can we divide a country? We need to stand together. In Frederick, I heard rumor that when they voted whether or not we should secede with the rest of the South, our good sheriff arrested some of those fine folk in our city who wanted to vote to secede. And, of course, it was false charges. I heard rumor that after we won by one vote to not secede, he released all them from prison. Many of you are old enough to remember those, because that wasn't that long ago. But it just goes to show you that we are trying so hard to stay together as a union. In the beginning of this country, George Washington, although he was a good friend of mine, it is true he was 20 years older than me. My other good friend was Francis Scott Key from Frederick. He was a classmate of my husband's. Many of you remember Francis Scott. His family still live here, and he was 15 years younger than me. He was the same age as my husband. They were classmates. So Francis Scott and I became good friends. He would come over, and boy, him and I would talk about politics and talk about the direction this country should go. And as I served tea for him and my husband and the other politicians in the area, we really debated where we should go with our politics. When George Washington passed away, it was Francis Scott Key and myself that planned George Washington's memorial. Francis Scott Key put together a lot of the music for the service, and I put together other parts of the memorial service and the processional. As a thank you, Francis Scott Key gave me a paisley scarf that I still cherish, and it's I still have it today. So you can see that being a part of this country from the beginning, I have taken such pride in every star that I have sewn on this flag. And to think of it as someday, because of this rebellion being divided, is just beyond comprehension. Now some of you know there's many reasons why the South want to fight and separate. A lot of it has to do with political reasons. They want states' rights and things. But we also know that slavery is a part of it. And here in Maryland, as you know, I have spoken out against slavery many times. I have been so against slavery. And yet, that has been to my detriment because they have held that against me. As you know, one day, people in Frederick who wanted to make a mockery of me dropped off little Henry, who was 10 years old, and he was lame. He had a bum leg, so he wasn't any good to the plantation owner. But he knew that I couldn't just give him his freedom, or I could be hung or tarred and feathered for giving a slave his freedom. So what was I going to do? So my husband and I took him into our house, and many of you have known him over the years. We raised him as our own. He learned to read and write. He worked here with my husband side by side, earned a wage, and we bought him a house on the same street, just down the street from us. Unfortunately, as many of you know, Henry died several years ago as well. And it's been very hard. He was like a son that I never had. That leads me to General Lee's, the great General Lee's Maryland campaign. And this is when he was spending the whole month of September trying to come into our border state, trying to deliver propaganda to each door saying, hey, we want your young men to sign up and join the Confederacy. If they did that, he knew that the war would end much quicker because there would be nothing protecting our nation's capital. There would be nothing protecting, and the war would end. So instead, Lincoln, knowing how badly we wanted, that he needed us as a border state, he made a proposition. We could keep our slaves as long as we stayed a neutral state. So we voted to stay a border state and not have the issue of slavery, which breaks my heart to see what's happening. As many of you know, that issue of slavery has totally divided us. My own pastor at the German Reformed Church in town here, who speaks out against slavery, who speaks out against this rebellion, has his own son who owns slaves, working as a surgeon for the Confederacy. We have many people in town. As you go up and down the streets, you'll see just as many Confederacy flags as you do Union flags in the yards. When the Confederates would come through Maryland on their way to battle, sometimes they would rest right outside my doorstep. And the reason is, as you know, I have spring water right outside my door, and they want to give their horses a break or take my ladle and go out and get some fresh water for themselves. So you can imagine, I wouldn't let them stop in my yard, and I was seen many times shaking a broom at a Confederate soldier, telling him to get off my property, and I even hid my ladle when I knew they were coming through town. So I wasn't friendly to them, and yet I know that a lot of them are our own neighbors. But it's something that I think we need, when we have a point of view, we need to hold up to that point of view. So, shortly after that, on September 5th, I was in bed and I heard outside all of these Confederate soldiers. They were coming through and cavalry coming through on their horses, ripping down people's flags. They were burning them in the street. I looked out my bedroom window. They were tying them around their boots so that when they kicked their horse, the spurs would rip through and shred the flags, and then they'd throw them in the middle of the street and start them on fire. They came and broke the wooden staff in front of my house and grabbed my flag. They left it in the yard, and I went out in my front yard. I picked up that flag. I went out up to my bedroom window, and I waved that flag at them, and I said that they were not going to get my flag for being rebellious. That's when Stonewall's men started to shoot at me. They turned around and they started to shoot at a 95-year-old woman. Can you imagine? Well, lucky for me, it was the Confederates, because although they hit the window pane and the wooden frame, I was untouched, but they continued to shoot. Stonewall Jackson came around on his horse and saw what his men was doing, and he told them, ready, aim, fire. And he led the charge against me. They shot again, and instead of cowering, I continued to wave that flag, and I looked right at Stonewall and I said, you go ahead and shoot every gray hair on this old lady's head, but you won't shoot the flag out of your country, I said. So when I waved this, Stonewall, he looked down and he looked kind of humbled. He said later that I reminded him of his own grandma. And he said, for her bravery, that's the only flag that will remain waving in the streets today. He told his men, anyone who continued to shoot at me, he would shoot dead as a dog in the street. And he meant it. With his protection, what did I do? I continued to yell at those men as they came across my yard, and I told them they should be ashamed of themselves. I told them to think about what their mothers would think. And boy, I continued to do that until they were out of the city. So, after the Confederates left, Jesse Reno came through. And Jesse Reno, as you know, was a brave Union general for our Army. And he came through here on September 13th. And on that day, I was so surprised. All of us were standing outside in front of my house for this big parade, And we were waving all of our small parade flags. We're waving those as these brave Union soldiers come through, chasing out all of those Confederate soldiers, and we are so happy to see them. And Jesse Reno stops in front of my house, and he pointed to me and said he wanted to hear my story. He heard what I had done. I was so surprised that he would take the time to visit with me. Just then, my neighbor, who was the same age as me across the street, who also had seen the War of 1776, Jesse Reno looked at both of us and told his men, "This is the spirit of '76. So, he came in my house. I was thrilled. I started to offer him my homemade tea, like you're enjoying, but I realized he might enjoy something else. And as you know, I make quite a good homemade wine, so I offered him some homemade wine. He used my writing desk. He wrote to his wife the whole story of how I stood up to Stonewall Jackson. He sent that letter in the mail to her from my writing desk. It was such an honor to have him here. He asked if he could have the flag that was shot in Torrance. But to me, it was kind of a feeling of pride. It was something I just didn't want to part with. And I have several flags in my house. I have one that I keep outside all the time for parades. I have a small silk one I keep in my Bible. I have a nice banner that I keep out on the porch. And I have my little parade flag. So I decided the one to give him was the little silk one from that was kept inside my Bible. And I told him that one was precious to me. And so he said he would carry that with him off to battle. The very next day, he went off to battle, and many of you know the Battle of Antietam, and that is where he was killed. When they found his body, he had the flag that I had given him in his uniform. So the uniform and that flag, when it arrived for his wife, she not only saw the flag for me, but she had also received the letter with the story that he had sent from my house. So, other things that I want to share with you about this story is every time, whether it's the Confederates coming through town or whether it's the Union coming through town, the townspeople were accommodating to whatever side they were. Our stores were open to both sides. The churches were open to both sides. Many of our churches became hospitals. In fact, Frederick had more hospitals during these battles than most people had seen, because most of the major battles so far have been within miles, very close to our city. So when we walk into the hospital, I have volunteered many hours in there. And when I go there, I am working with both Confederate soldiers as well as Union, because I realize that at the end of this war, we are all American, and we have to find a way to live together. So at this time, I'm going to lay down and rest, because at being 95, my throat is getting quite sore and I'm feeling very tired. So moving ahead on the timeline, 2 weeks, I'm no longer Barbara Fritchie, but 2 weeks later, after this birthday party, Barbara Fritchie came down with pneumonia. A lot of people think that at the birthday party, she was just so excited about telling her story, and it's winter time, and she came down with a bad cold. She died on December 18th, 1862. She never lived long enough to know that John Greenleaf Whittier would write a famous poem about her life. And I would like to share this poem with you. How many of you know John Greenleaf Whittier? Okay, he was a famous poet during the 1800s. All of his poems were nonfiction. They were all based on fact. Many of them were to motivate people. He wrote one about anti-slavery, to try to motivate people that that this was wrong. He tried to let people know that the North needs to keep fighting to keep us together as a nation. So here is the poem he wrote to inspire the North to keep fighting. Up from the meadows rich with corn, clear in the cool September morn, the clustered spires of Frederick stand, green walled by the hills of Maryland. Round about them orchards sweep, apple and peach tree fruited deep. Fair is the garden of the Lord, to the eyes of the famished rebel horde. On that pleasant morn of the early fall, when Lee marched over the mountain wall, over the mountains winding down, horse and foot into Frederick town. 40 flags with their silver stars, and 40 flags with their crimson bars. Flapped in the morning wind, the sun of noon looked down, and saw not one. Up rose old Barbara Fritchie then, bowed with her 80 years and 10, bravest of all in Frederick town. She took up the flag that the men hauled out. Sorry. In her attic window the staff she set. She showed that one heart was loyal yet. Up the street came the rebel tread, Stonewall Jackson riding ahead. Under his slouched hat, left and right he glanced. The old flag met his sight. Halt! The dust-brown ranks stood fast. Fire outblazed the rifle blast. It shivered the window, pane and sash. It rent the banner and seamed a gash. Quick as it fell from the broken staff, Dame Barbara snatched the silken scarf. She leaned far out the window sill and shook it forth with a royal will. Shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare your country's flag, she said. A shade of sadness, a blush of shame over the face of the leader came. The nobler nature within him stirred to life at that woman's deed and word. Who touches a hair on yon gray head dies like a dog. March on, he said. All day long through Frederick Street sounded the tread of marching feet. All day long that free flag tossed over the heads of the rebel host, Ever its torn folds rose and fell on the loyal winds that loved it well. And though the hill gaps, sunset light shone over it with a warm good night. Barbara Fritchie's work is over, and the rebel rides on his raids no more. Honor to her, and let a tear fall for her sake on Stonewall's bier. Over Barbara Fritchie's grave, flag of freedom and union wave, peace and order and beauty drawn, round the symbol of light and law. And ever the stars above look down on the stars below in Frederick town. So the reason why Whittier wrote this poem was to motivate the North. He said that all of his poems were true nonfiction and they were meant to inspire us. His effort was, if a 95-year-old woman can stand up to Jackson, certainly we can do our part. However, shortly after this poem was written, people were trying to debunk her story. The question I had at the time was, why are they trying so hard to debunk her story? Tourists would come almost immediately, war still going on. But as they came through Frederick, they heard this is where Barbara Fritchie stood up to Stonewall. Local people from Frederick, depending on which one you talk to, would say, oh, she's not a real person. Other people would say, yeah, she's real, but she's deaf, she's dumb, she lives in that house. Deaf and dumb was a real term. I grew up in Faribault, I know it's not appropriate. But at that time, that's what they were saying. They kept changing their story. They said, yeah, she was in her room, she was sick, she was bedridden. Her niece had to prop her up against the window to wave her flag as the parade went by. Their story changed every time a tourist asked, and that led people to be curious. Why are they trying to debunk her story? Why are they trying to say it didn't happen? At the time, a famous teacher down the road, she was actually in view from Barbara's house on the same street, and her home, it's where her mother lived, And her mother was blind, which might be where they kind of intertwined that story. But she was very much a Confederate. And her name was Mary Quintrell. How many of you have heard of the famous Quintrell Raiders? Okay. So the famous Quintrell Raider is her husband's uncle. Okay, so they were very Confederate, the whole family, including Mary and her husband. So Mary Quintrell's father-in-law was running a propaganda newspaper out of Washington, D.C. And they couldn't live with him in that area because of fear of being found out. So he sent her to live with her mother in Frederick. So the family was kind of split up. Her only students that she was homeschooling, there were 8 students, and I have searched all 8 of them. Every one of them were definitely Confederate students. They have sworn that it was Mary who actually went out with the flag, and that Stonewall Jackson wasn't there, and it never happened, and Barbara, I think was in bed. And my question was, why would a Confederate woman have done it? And that didn't make sense, and they were just trying to, destroy the story. So anyway, after lots of research, I found very reliable people, like a judge and a lawyer who spoke against Barbara and swore under oath that it never happened. We also have another judge and a lawyer and a pastor who said it did happen. And all of this is under oath, and I'm thinking, you can go back in Frederick. I had at least 4 trips over a 10-year period to Frederick, Maryland to research all of their stuff. They have so much written in records, the church records. The church has a little historical museum area all on her artifacts, and I read her actual diary. I read her husband's diary. I read the neighbor across the street. His diary is all preserved. And it was so interesting to me to hear such opposite sides of the story about the same woman. So, a person across the street became a very famous person, mainly because he wrote a diary. Jacob Engelbretson, he wrote every day in this diary. And that was a good way of being able to tell when things happen. On September 5th, the day in question that I say this incident happened, the day that her niece was told it happened, the day that Barbara put in writing it happened, in his diary, he describes all of the chaos in the street, that he heard cannons, he heard guns, he could smell the fire. People were hiding underneath their kitchen tables. They were trying not to come outside because they were afraid of what was going on. There was all this commotion. But the Confederate people were trying to say that this supposed incident with Barbara happened on the 10th. And Stonewall Jackson had been kicked by his horse, and he was laid up, and so it couldn't have happened. But at the time, nobody ever said it happened on the 10th, and in the diary, he said it was a still night. And so in his early years, he defended Barbara and kept saying it happened and all this. At the very end of his life, he had been asked now, I don't know how many times, and at the very end of his life, he said, well, they were showing him in his diary on the 10th where he says it's such a quiet night and how could this have happened? And he said, well, if it would have happened, I would have had it in my diary. So he was confused. And so there are people that now, when you go to Frederick, depending on who you get for your tour guide, they will say she either did it or she didn't. And so there's a lot of controversy. One of the things I had to find out is why. Why so many respectable people would swear under oath that she didn't do it, and why just as many would say she did. There's got to be something that we're not seeing here in this big picture. Well, how many of you know about the Lost Order 191? Okay. So this was a real embarrassing thing for the Confederacy. So they were coming through, and they were so sure that this plan was going to work. So they had the plans of where they supposedly were going to attack, and they wrote it out in detail, and they wrapped it around a bunch of cigars, and on purpose they dropped it in their path on the way. And then they were waiting way up. They thought they had plenty of time before the Union would follow. The Union would find these cigars, find this lost order, an official order 191 of where they're gonna be at for this attack, and they were gonna be able to win this battle and kill all these Union soldiers. However, they misjudged and were too confident in the time lapse. And the Union got there before they expected them, and they ended up not winning. Because it was an embarrassment, they didn't want Stonewall Jackson connected with that order. They also didn't want to put the pastor for Stonewall Jackson in harm's way. He was a local pastor there that Stonewall Jackson always attended his church, and they didn't want him to look guilty. He was in part of this. So they wrote this note that supposedly was from this pastor that said, sorry I missed you at church today, I'll see you next week. And it was supposed to be written on the 10th, the day that this supposedly happened, to put him in town that day and all this stuff. Well, anyway, the ironic thing was that at that time, the printers traveled with the troops. And so the kind of printer you had, if you had like the letter E was always up, it would be up on every single thing that that particular camp would send out. All the propaganda sent out should have the same kind of typeset from those old-fashioned printers. So the printer that came, all the propaganda notes look identical, except the one many years later they found with this supposed note on the back that gave Stonewall Jackson and this pastor an alibi, is written with a more modern type. It doesn't have the letters that were like all the rest of them. And supposedly that letter is now missing from the museum because there has been too much controversy. Another man, his name is Douglas, and he wrote a book called I Rode with Jackson. In the book, it came out right after, the war was still going on, and he wrote this book about everything. He makes no mention at all, because it wasn't a big deal at this time, right away about the incident with Barbara or anything like that, and when the book is published. Okay, so that guy dies, and people are questioning, well, you don't write about everything, right, in this incident with an old woman that wasn't important to him and it wasn't written. But to his nephew, who was a Confederate that was in this plot to try to get enough propaganda, came out with a second edition of the original book, rewritten by the nephew. And he added in there, strangest language, I rode with Jackson, and we did not see Barbara Fritchie, and we did not, why all of a sudden the way they worded this, it was just weird, and people believed that book. That was written that many years after he died, so you can't really question. So then people asked the printer, who was known for printing a lot of the Confederate propaganda, can we see the original manual? Well, that went missing. That went missing. So a lot of very, very strange things with all that. There was a Confederate newsletter, actually newspaper, I'm sorry, and it still to this day is printed. It's for the Sons of the Confederacy. Shortly after Barbara became so famous with this poem, they wrote a mockery, same poem, same kind of beats to the stanza, but they're saying how she was blind and deaf and dumb and how could she have done this, and making fun of the Union people for even believing the story, to make fun of that. So, you mentioned you did some research before I came to talk. Did you find all this controversy?
Yes.
Yes, you did.
Well, it continued these articles until 1940.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Anyone that
definitely.
had any connection.
Right. So then there's an editor who says, and he's from the New York paper, and he said he was taking out of context, so he took a person's statement that says that he believes Barbara's story and everything, but the editor added sentences before that of his own opinion. And it doesn't match the original statement, when you find the original from other publishings, but everyone keeps reprinting the one from the New York where it has the editor's opinion at the beginning saying that it didn't happen. It was a strong imagination and all that. Okay, so one of the things that made it hard to fact check is the main people in this. Stonewall himself died well, I'll give you the dates here. So between Stonewall, Reno, and Barbara, all of them died within months of each other. So it's kind of hard to go back and question them on what happened. Jesse Reno died September 13th, 1862. So that is literally 9 days after the incident. Barbara Fritchie died December of 1862. She died 2.5 months after the incident. Stonewall Jackson was killed by his own men in friendly fire on May 10th, 1863. So when the poem came out, Stonewall Jackson's own wife had heard this story, and she was embarrassed by the poem, and she thanked John Leaf Whittier for making her husband look at least somewhat respectable towards an older woman, that he backed down, and she thanked him for that, and she believed the story. In her later years, she recanted that and had to say that it never happened. So in fact, when visiting Frederick on May 17th, 1943, Winston Churchill was driving with FDR. He requested to be taken to the Barbara Fritchie house. Churchill then got out of the car and he recited every line of the Barbara Fritchie Whittier poem from memory. They put actually a little plaque on the side of her house that says he was there and that he had done that, and it was in the paper at the time. So when I did my research, I actually wanted to prove one way or the other, was she really my ancestor or not? And I ended up finding 4 mysteries. The first was, did she do it or not? The second was, did she have slaves or not? In one of my visits to Frederick, Maryland, so everything my family ever told me is how much she was against slavery. And in all the personal diaries and everything, she was a thorn in people's side that had slaves. She apparently wrote many letters to both George Washington and Francis Scott Key, and both of them, I don't know if you're aware of that, both of them gave up their slaves, and she claims to be a big part of that she was just sickened by the fact that they had them. Both of them inherited their slaves and gave them freedom before they died, way before they died. Anyway, so I had to, when you go to the Barbara Fritchie house in Frederick, Maryland, they have a historical landmarker out there. And it says how it's a hypocritical, like many people of the time. You could, the people there, the majority of them, I'm looking at my mom because she also went with me on many of these trips. You can tell today that there's just as much Confederate sympathy as the Barbara Fritchie restaurant. I'm just going to give you an example. When we went there, we were very proud to eat at the Barbara Fritchie restaurant. They were supposedly using a lot of her recipes for the pies, and she was such a good hostess, always had people over for tea. That was her big thing, and to be social. And the new owner came over and talked to us, and he said how he couldn't believe that the Sons of the Confederacy met there monthly, and they had a Confederate flag that they kept there in the restaurant that they would bring out, and it was like a mockery that they would do this. And he put it into it when he started there, that he said that the town is definitely half and half. So I had to check into this. Why was it that she would be so outspoken, and yet we know that she had this slave, Henry. Henry was given to her as a gift, and from everything I read from those particular years that he was there, she could not have given him his freedom without being prosecuted. They throughout history, they had different, shortly after that, they did start with that, and I can't pronounce it very good, manumission, something like that, where you are able to do that. So that is about the time period when the Methodist minister who had black members of his congregation and I believe his secretary was black, and he came to Barbara and he said, I need to have you purchase a black slave so we can give it its freedom. And here's what I found out. This little baby, George, that was only a couple months old, was being sold at the auction block for slavery, which would have separated him from his mother. His mother is a slave, so there's no choice. The grandma is free. The grandma, even though she is free, cannot purchase the slave. But Barbara Fritchie can purchase the slave and gift it to the grandma. So when you go to Frederick, they will tell you this is one of the slaves she owned. I can assure you that baby never spent one day in her household, but the paperwork that I found, it is her actual contract, and it says that she is purchasing George Davis, it's a 1-month-old or a 2-month-old, but I can't remember the exact wording, it's in my book. Under the circumstances, it is gifted to Nancy Davis, who is the grandma, and he has to remain her slave. The law at that time was for 21 years, at which time he will have his freedom. And that's how it had to be worded. So he would live with his grandma. In the meantime, the mother eventually got her years of freedom, and the three lived together. And they're in the census reports in that area that they lived together. He never was listed in the household of Barbara, but that is one of the slaves that she purchased. And then Henry was one she owned, and I found no other slaves ever that she owned. But when you read the description outside her home, it says it was hypocritical that here she said she was an abolitionist and she owned slaves. And to me, I almost didn't finish the book. I can remember coming home telling my ancestor owned slaves. I'm not gonna. I was devastated until I researched and I found it's just so strange how they want to make her out to be some kind of villain. The other thing was they were trying to say that she never had children. And this is a huge mystery that I had to solve. So, you'll see a photo, it's those old tin photos that has been folded in half. And that is for the daughter of Barbara Fritchie. And she ran off with Daniel Colburn, the coachman for the Oneida community. Does anybody know what the Oneida community is?
Those are indigenous people in Wisconsin, aren't they?
Well, that's the Oneida, yes, they have that, but before they even, so there was Oneida in New York. Oneida in New York. And so what they were was, during this time period, there were many religious communes, and they all had a kind of a different set of rules for each of these different kinds of commune. This one, they believed that everything in their community was communal. So if you joined that, every single day everybody came together and you had worship service every morning. Everybody took care of everybody's kids. Everybody took care of all the jobs, and you did everything as a thing, which meant you also shared your spouses, and it was not appropriate. Barbara Fritchie said, if you run off, you're disowned. And so she disowned her daughter. Her daughter had a daughter. Abraham Lincoln was shutting down all of these communities. And so he was shutting down the Oneida community. That is the first time that Mary Colburn, who was a teenager, came to meet Barbara Fritchie, met her grandma, and Barbara Fritchie gave her a picture of herself. That's the picture we have of Barbara Fritchie that's been passed on. Gave her a picture of her mother that was disowned, that was folded in half, an old tin. And she's got the big cross from the Oneida community, and we have a picture of her community and the thing there, and explained everything to Mary Colburn. Mary then goes back to Oneida community in New York, and I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but they sent wagons full of people because they were being disbanded, and they settled in Bethel, Minnesota, and they named it Bethel from the Bible. and they are from the Oneida community. And surprise! So that is, and maybe we shouldn't have that part of the video, too late. So I'm embarrassing my two daughters up here then. So that is, kind of a weird thing. So this Mary Colburn, who met her grandma for the first time and hears the story and gets the picture of her grandmother and has this pride in her grandma for what she did with Stonewall Jackson, brings these stories back and everything. She marries Albert Augustus Thayer, who during the Civil War was a 17-year-old drummer boy. And that's my ancestor. It would be my dad's great-grandfather. And so Albert Augustus Thayer and Mary Colburn, they buy the Thayer Hotel that's in Annandale, Minnesota. How many of you have heard of the Thayer Hotel in Annandale? If any of you like ghosts, you gotta spend a night there. They have a Civil War drummer boy that'll, he entertains you. So that is kind of a famous landmark. So she died, Mary Colburn, after her second child, and that's the descendant that becomes my ancestor, her second child. And so these two young boys then are raised by their stepmom and their dad, Albert Augustus Thayer, who goes on and has 5 more kids with his second wife. They all work in the Thayer Hotel, and eventually brings it down to my family, which end up in Faribault. So my family were the Thayers that were from Faribault here many years ago. So that's kind of the history of that. So now with our advanced research, we can do DNA, correct? So I have done DNA on Ancestry.com, and I have several Howers from Barbara Howard's family that are a match. I do not have a Fritchie who is a match. And I truly believe with the timeline that Barbara Fritchie, during those years she was sent to Boston for her advanced schooling, I think, is when she had her daughter. Her daughter Barbara was also named Barbara Colburn, who became Barbara, I'm sorry, it was Barbara Fritchie, her daughter, who became Barbara Colburn. So when the census reports and everything show that Barbara Fritchie, when she comes back from Boston, she marries a man who's 15 years younger than her eventually. He never had kids, and she gave him all the status. She came from kind of a well-to-do family. He came from what once was a well-to-do family. His father was a doctor and surgeon. It was a well-to-do family, but during the American Revolution, he was on the wrong side of it. So he felt disgraced, and I think marrying Barbara was kind of it was a win-win for both of them. They raised this child claiming, because when she came back it was already a young child, claiming that it was his niece. So at first there was rumors, it's in some of the books there and different other people's diaries. At first they say it is a younger sibling, which he didn't have when he was the youngest of his family. Then they said it was a niece. So we have those two stories, but it's always in the household, and then the daughter's gone. So there is a daughter who really was in that household during that time, and the DNA does match fine. So the story of this Barbara Fritchie, the daughter, running off with Daniel Colburn, was in several of the historical documents going back several generations before me. That's been documented, so it's not like something that I just came up with. It's something that's been there. And in my great-grandfather's obituary, it says he was the, at that time I think he'd be the great-grandson of Barbara Fritchie, and they say the one who stood up to Stonewall. So it's been passed on through my family all this time, until all of a sudden now we find out that over in Frederick they're saying, yeah, it didn't happen. So, I went there and said, I want to talk to you and find out why, and it's been interesting who I talked to there, how they want to handle me. So let's see if I got any other things I might have missed on here. When I talked to you about how Frederick was the crossroads, if you look here at where Frederick is located, so Frederick is right here, and the red is where the Confederate battles were and the path, and then the blue is the Union. And you can see it's like if you were to look at a bicycle wheel and you see all the spokes going through in the middle, and Frederick's right in the middle. And I'll just pass that around. I mean, they are literally right in the hot spot there. If you girls want to pass that one back, that's just that one didn't print as well, but you still see where that is on there.
Tammy, when you said Coburns, there's also Coburns in that St. Cloud, Annandale area.
I know.
Related at all?
So I have not figured that out yet. That's my sister's been asking me to double check that because they're in that area, I know, and I am curious on that. It'd be nice, maybe I belong to the food chain here and then, you know, the grocery stores. So, and then this I'm gonna pass around. This just kind of shows you the timeline of her life. So basically from the very beginning to now. And I'm just gonna ask if anyone has any questions for me. The judges that that stood up for her, the one that in her hometown, so he claimed that he was actually even a neighbor, and he saw several times how she would take the broom and get the Confederates off, and he said how she was always checking on the status of you know, what was going on with the war and everything, and he had heard first counts of what had happened and believed it from the beginning. So, I mean, it's interesting. One of the lawyers who spoke out and was very influential back in the time for causing a lot of this against her was her own niece's husband. And what happened is his father, who was a lawyer, was to handle the estate of her husband. And when Barbara Fritchie's husband died, his name was John Fritchie, when he died, the lawyer that they had been friends with and knew from the church and were really, really good friends with, and he did not own slaves, they had like minds and all that, but his son, this lawyer's son, owned slaves. And Barbara stood up in her church, and it's in the minutes of their church, and the pastor, when she gives you a tour of their little thing, talks about the history of that, because it was a very unusual moment in history where a woman asked to get up and speak to the congregation, and she said her husband has died, and she does not want the lawyer who's to represent the state, the good one died, and the son who owns the slaves, she didn't want to represent the estate. And she said she wanted a lawyer with morals, and she wanted to know if any other member of the church would take over the handling of the estate. Of course, someone did. That offended this lawyer, and he was married to her niece, but he was Confederate, very outspoken about being Confederate, and he owned slaves. So when there was all this controversy, he said how you know, it didn't happen, and he was one who was saying how sick she was and laid up in bed and all this stuff, even though there were witnesses at this birthday party. This birthday party, tea party, was a real thing, and that really happened where she told her story, and she really did get sick shortly after that. All that stuff happened, and that's in several of the diaries where she told the story. So his motivation was he was embarrassed by what she did, so now he's embarrassing her back, you know.